So today's daf is Tzadi, which is number 90, and we're going to start 3 lines down from the top of daf Tzadi Amud Aleph with Klipe Egozin Uklipe Rimonim Satis Ufua Kedei Litzboa Beged Katan. So what it said in the Mishnah was, we're again still on the subject of the Masekhet Hotza'ah, the prohibition of carrying items out on Shabbat, and for any item to be carried out on Shabbat, for it to be a violation of Shabbat, it needs to be a quantity which is significant. Now, obviously, most of these quantities are rather small. But still, we need to know if a person accidentally carried out an amount on Shabbat, would they be liable? Would they have to bring a korban chatat to atone for their mistake? So if they brought something which was so tiny that it's completely insignificant, we wouldn't hold them responsible at all. That's really the issue. So how much nutshells or the shells of pomegranates or satis and fuar, also other vegetation that was used for dye, to make dye. So the amount that it would take to make dye, to dye the smallest piece of clothing, which was this little piece of fabric that would go onto a lady's hat. That's the minimum amount that's considered significant. So the Gemara asks, Uraminhi, but we raise an objection to that. Hamotzi samanim shiruyin kedei litzboa behen dugma le'ira. That we said earlier that the amount of dye that's considered significant is not the amount that it takes to dye this piece of cloth, but it's actually the amount of dye that it takes to dye a tiny scrap, which was used as a sample for color. You would have like these little samples for colors to show people. That's even smaller. So why are you telling me it's the amount of dye that's needed for a larger surface area? Really, it should be the amount of dye needed for an even smaller piece. So the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Nachman, and we actually saw this answer already. The Gemara gave this answer earlier on another Mishnah. Amar Rabba bar Avua, Rav Nachman said that Rabba bar Avua said, Lefi she'en adam toreach lishrot samemanim litzbo behen dugma le'ira. The answer is like this: that when the question is, what are you carrying? If you're carrying dye that's already made, so what's the minimum use of a dye? It's to color a tiny sample. But if you're making dye, if you're carrying the ingredients from which dye is made, and you haven't made it yet, who's going to go to the trouble of actually making dye just to make a tiny sample like that? You're not going to make a whole batch of dye for that. You might make a batch of dye to dye the piece of cloth that goes on a hat, because that's significant. So when we're trying to measure the significance of the ingredients of dye, the question is, what's the minimum amount of ingredients that one would actually make dye from? And there needs to be a justification for it, which is it needs to be a significant piece of cloth that's going to be dyed. But when we're talking about already made dye, what is the minimum amount of dyeing that you would actually do? And the answer is for a sample. So depending on the state of the materials, whether it's raw material or it's already processed, the quantity that's significant could be more or less. Because production of dye is going to require a greater justification than an act of dyeing, which could be on a much, much smaller scale. So now we said mei raglayim, how much urine? Now urine is not something that we generally want to carry out with us, but it used to be used as a type of detergent or stain remover back in the old days, believe it or not. So tana mei raglayim ad ben arba'im yom, that they would keep urine up to 40 days, and up to 40 days it was considered to be some kind of a caustic cleaner that they would use to remove stains. Nowadays we would say if you had urine on your clothing, you needed to clean it. Back then they would say if you had urine on your clothing, good job, you're cleaning it. That's what it sounds like. Okay. So neter. Neter is, again, a type of soap or a type of a detergent that they would use. So tana neter Alexandrit velo neter an panterin. So Rashi says that this is talking about the neter that came, the substance that was gotten from Alexandria was more potent, and therefore the amount that was needed to be considered significant was less than the neter that was gotten from this place called Anpantarin, because the one that they got from Anpantarin, I guess, was weaker, and therefore more of it would be necessary to be considered significant for carrying on Shabbat. Borit. What is borit? Amar Rav Yehuda zechol. Rav Yehuda says, you know what borit is? Sand. Sand also could be used as a cleaner, because if you wanted to get a something out of your clothing, you would use sand as a cleaning agent. Ve'atanya, but we learned in a Braita ha-borit ve'achol. In another list, it lists borit and chol as two different things. Sand is one thing, borit is another thing. How can you tell me they're the same thing? Ela mai borit kavrita. What is borit then? Sulfur, kavrita. Sulfur can be used as a caustic type of cleansing agent or detergent. Metive, but they raised an objection. Hosifu aleihen hachalbitzin v'hala'inon v'haborit v'ha'ahal. When we talked about things that are prohibited during Shemitah, they included in this list various items, including borit and several other things here, and ahal, aloe. So the question is, and these other items that we don't necessarily know the precise identification of them, but different plants. So obviously, v'yisal katatach kavrita. If you're telling me that borit means sulfur, kavrita mi'ita b'shvi'it, is there a prohibition during Shemitah of using sulfur? Sulfur is not a plant. Sulfur comes out of the ground. Ze'aklal, we learned, kol sheyesh lo ikar yesh lo shvi'it. It has to have a root in the ground to be subject to Shemitah. V'shein lo ikar en lo shvi'it. Something that doesn't have a root that it grows from, there's no prohibition of Shemitah. There's no prohibition of mining minerals or getting sulfur out of the ground to use on Shemitah. It's only plants, vegetation. So the fact that borit is included in a list of things that are prohibited on Shemitah means it cannot be sulfur. Ela mai borit ahala. Rather, borit must be aloe. But wait a second. Ve'atani, you just told me about borit va'ala. You just told me that borit and ahal, which is aloe, are listed in the same list. So how can they be on the same list if they're the same thing? Answer, tzurei gavnei ala. There are two different types of aloe, and the borit and what's called ahala are two different subspecies of aloe, but they're both the same kind of thing. They're both a type of vegetation that is used for cleaning. Just like today we use aloe, a lot of different soaps or lotions, they use aloe. They used it back then too. The kimolia, what's kimolia? Amar Rav Yehuda, shelof dutz. Rashi says, I have no idea what this is. And if Rashi has no idea what it is, neither do I. But it's some kind of a detergent that they used back in the old days. Eshlag, Amar Shmuel, Shaltinu lechol nachotei yama. Shmuel says, I asked all of the seafarers. When they didn't know what a word meant, they would go to the sailors, they were the most traveled people. And they would say, have you ever heard this word before? Do you know what it is? If they didn't know the identity of a word. So he said, V'amruli, they said to me, Shonana shemei. It's actually called Shonana. Umishtakach benukvad de marganita umafkele biramtzad de parzela. It's found in a hole inside of an oyster, basically. Okay, inside of a marganita means like a pearl. Okay, they would find it inside, and they would remove it with an iron tool that they would extract it from. Apparently, there was some kind of a hole inside the pearl or inside of the oyster itself or whatever it was that they would extract this substance from, and this substance was used also as some kind of a cleansing agent. And the minimum amount of cleansing agent that needs to be that it is considered significant is the amount that it takes to clean a small garment, or the amount that it takes to remove a small stain, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Okay. But these different listed items, by the time the Gemara is dealing with them hundreds of years after the Mishnah was written, they didn't know what all of these things referred to all the time. So they would have to, because language changes. Just like, we don't put things in perspective. It would be like looking at something written in the year 1700. That it describes some substance, and we would say, well, what is that they used for cleaning? I have no idea what they're talking about. Because we don't use anything like that anymore. So Shmuel is looking back, let's say 100 years plus. He's looking back, a century or more. He was an earlier Amorah, but still, he's looking back pretty far, trying to understand what these words mean that were written in the Mishnah. New Mishnah says, Pilpelet kol shehu, pepper, any amount, even a tiny amount is considered significant. We're going to see that this is not referring to our pepper of today. Rashi says, this is not the pepper of Europe. There's a different pepper. Right, it's not the same. Ve'itran, tar, kolshu, also smallest amount. Mine bisamim, any kind of fragrant spice. Umine matachot, kolshen, any kind of metal, even the smallest amount. Because they're all functional. Even the smallest amount of any of these items is functional. Me'avnei hamizbeach u'me'afar hamizbeach, mekak sefarim u'mekak mitpechotehem, kolshu. If you had a tiny stone from the altar of the Beit HaMikdash, or a tiny bit of earth from the altar of the Beit HaMikdash, or you had worm chewed up sfarim, like a tiny piece of, let's say, a Sefer Torah that was chewed off by worms, by something infested the sfarim, or the cover of the Sefer Torah was chewed up by worms, and you were going to dispose of it, but you had like a piece from that. Even the smallest piece is significant. Why? Because you attach significance to it, not because you want to use it. You're not going to use the piece of rock from the altar. You're not going to use the earth from the altar. You're not going to use the piece of a Sefer Torah that wasted away, but you're going to bury it. And since you're going to bury it, it's significant. You're going to protect it. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Afa motzi misham she'avodah zara koshu, shene'emar v'lo yidbak bi'adecha me'uma min acheret. According to Rabbi Yehuda, even if you took out something related to idolatry, in other words, something used in the service of idolatry which is prohibited, you're prohibited to have it. You're prohibited to benefit from it. You have to destroy it. But because the Torah says me'uma, you're not allowed to have even the tiniest amount, that means that the halacha looks at the tiniest amount as significant. Significant in a bad way. So Rabbi Yehuda's chidush is that significance doesn't just mean significance. And the Mishnah is telling you that significance can mean significance even when it's significant because you're going to bury it, like a piece of Sefer Torah fell off. It's still significant because you have a mitzvah of burying it. Rabbi Yehuda goes further than that. He says significance can even mean when it's a mitzvah to destroy it, because you're not allowed to have it, even the tiniest amount of anything related to idolatry. Now, earlier in the Mishnah, this idea was rejected earlier in the Gemara, that the majority of Chachamim say no. If it's something that actually has to be destroyed, it's not significant. We say the opposite. We say since it's condemned, it's not significant. The Rabbi Yehuda is saying no. Once the Torah gives it significance, even if the significance is to say you're not allowed to have it, that grants it a certain status. Just like when you tell your child, don't touch this. Oh, don't touch this. It must be something important. Okay, now it becomes something significant.
So with the significance, does that change as the times progress? Like, for example, back in the day, urine was important. Now...
No, for sure. I would think definitely, like today, you would have to look at it in terms of the usage today. What is a person, so you might say, okay, a urine sample that a doctor has is significant. Right? Urine today would be considered trash. It would be considered... nobody would use it for any purpose. And then many things that they might have considered trash that today we would consider significant. So yeah, it's definitely relative. Maybe even smaller amounts of ink than they thought, or smaller amounts of dye, because we do like micro, things that they didn't do. It could be that our shiurim would be even stricter in some of them than they were back then. So now the Gemara says, Pilpelet koshu, like these people who do art on a tiny little spot because they have those microscopes, and they can write the whole Shir HaShirim or something in some tiny little thing because they use a magnifying glass. So even a much smaller amount can be significant now. It's amazing. So, Pilpelet koshu, lemay chazia. Why is even the tiniest amount of pepper, and again, this is some kind of pepper that we're not familiar with necessarily, why is it significant? Because l'reach hapeh, because somebody would put it in their mouth for bad breath. It's like a Tic Tac or something, right? They put it in their mouth for bad breath. Itran koshu, what is tar? Lemay chazia letzil chata. Apparently, if a person had a migraine headache or something, or a bad headache, they would use tar for that. I guess they would put tar on them. They would apply it to their heads a little bit. It would make it feel better. I have no idea. Mine bisamim koshen. What about fragrant spices? Even the tiniest amount of Rabban, the rabbis taught, hamotzi reach ra koshehu, shemen tov koshu. If you brought something that's a bad smelling thing, or a really good smelling oil, argaman koshehu. Rashi says this must mean a purple dye that had a fragrant smell, because otherwise it would be under the regular rule of dye, which would have to be enough dye to actually cover surface area. He's saying it's even koshehu. Uvtulata vered, the petal of a rose. How romantic. There's nothing more romantic than the petal of a rose. Everyone's going to tell you the petal of a rose is something special, right? Even one petal, somebody attaches significance to it, right? So, achat, even one of them is significant. So what does that mean? That things that are significant because of an aesthetic purpose, that's what these are, aesthetically beautiful. They smell good or they smell bad. Rashi says that they would have bad smelling things that they would put to ward off things that you don't want. Like, for example, if you want to keep raccoons away, you can put like things that smell bad, or if you want to keep certain animals away, or it says mazikin, I guess shedim or demons, whatever they had, that they would want to ward them off by putting bad smelling substances around. So something that's valued because of its smell, even a tiny amount of smell, is going to be there. Or one rose petal might not have any functional significance, but it's something beautiful. It's a thing of beauty. Somebody's going to attach significance to it aesthetically, even if not physically. So, minei matachot kol shehen. What about a tiny amount of metal? What function does that have? Lemay chazu. Tani Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer shekin roi lasot mimena darban katan. You can make a tiny, like a nut, with it to connect two pieces, like a tiny little nail with it, or a tiny little peg with a small amount of metal that could stick two things together. In other words, it can have a function because it's strong and solid. So you can find some kind of mechanical use even for the smallest amount of metal. If a person swears to donate iron to the Beit HaMikdash, so how much does he have to give? Is the question. He just said barzel. He didn't say how much. So how much does he have to give? So Achirim say, and Achirim is always a reference to Rabbi Meir, lo yivchot me'ama al ama. He can't give less than 1 amma by 1 amma. An amma is about this long. So 1 amma by 1 amma is the minimum amount square. An amma square is the minimum amount that he has to contribute. Lemay chazia, what's the purpose of it? Amar Rav Yosef, lechalya orev. Because what they would have was on the roof of the Beit HaMikdash, they had plates of metal that was called the kalya orev, which means it kept the birds away. They didn't want birds to come and mess on the Beit HaMikdash, basically. So what they would do was, they put these sharp metal pieces up there that had sharp edges and also had nails coming out of them. So there was nowhere for them to sit.
They have skyscrapers today.
Yeah, so they would have nowhere to sit. So they had that on the Beit HaMikdash. So they would be made out of 1 amma square pieces of metal. Some reported this, the same idea, but just in the opposite order, that that a person should give the amount that it could be a piece of this special roofing. And how much is that? Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Lama, that Rav Yosef explained the measurement. In other words, in the first version, it said the measurement of an amma square, and it said, what's the purpose of it? Oh, to keep the ravens away. Then the second version said, you have to put enough to keep the ravens away, and the question was, well, how much is that? Oh, 1 amma square, because it was made out of 1 amma square pieces of metal. If a person says nechoshet, that they're going to give nechoshet, brass or copper, lo yifchot mima kesef, then they have to give at least the value of a ma'ah of silver, which is that means actually a dollar amount, basically, of copper. And Tanya, we learned in a brighter Rabbi Eliezer Omer lo yivchot mitzvah ketana shel nechoshet, that the amount that he has to give of copper is the amount that you could make a tiny little fork or a tiny little tool out of copper. And what did they use it for? Because when they would cut or size the wicks for the menorah, or when they would clean out the cups in the menorah, they would use this little tool made of copper that they would scrape it out. So that little tool is the minimum amount you have to give. So these are minimum amounts that don't relate to Shabbat directly, but they relate actually to Beit HaMikdash functionality. If a person makes an oath that they're going to contribute. So you see that obviously the measurement is not the same, because for Shabbat even the smallest amount is significant, but for the Beit HaMikdash, if you contributed a larger amount, would be necessary to be considered a donation of significance. So these are two different frameworks that we're looking at here. Mekak Sfarim, Mekak Mitpachot. So these worm-chewed pieces of a Sefer Torah, or of a covering of a Sefer Torah. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Mekak Desifrei, Techach Deshirae, Ve'elad Invei, Ufed Deteinei, Ve'had Rimonei. These are all different worms. In other words, Mekek is actually the name of the worm that would chew Sfarim. And then they had something called Techach that would chew silk. Something called Elah that would chew grapes. Something called Peh that would chew the figs, and something called Ha that would go into the pomegranates. In other words, they each had worms that were indigenous to them, so to speak, these worms that would eat these particular fruits. They're all dangerous. They were all dangerous. If you ate pomegranate and it had one of these worms in it, it could harm you. There was once a student in front of Rabbi Yochanan. He was eating figs. He said to his teacher, hey, there must be some thorns inside these figs because I taste something sharp. What was he really tasting? The worm. So Amar Le ketale peladen. We're in trouble because that worm is going to kill that guy. In other words, he said the peh, which is the name of the worm, is going to kill this student. In other words, that's what he feels. He thinks it's a thorn, but it's actually this dangerous worm that he is ingesting inadvertently. Obviously, he did not check his fruits for bugs. You should not be eating dates or figs without checking them anyway because they have bugs. Pomegranates, I don't think so, but...
that's why you got to go
you got to look, yeah.
Yeah. What I saw in America, if the figs or dates came from America and they have a reliable hexagon on it, then it's okay.
But probably they have better pesticides.
Interesting FDA fact, fig Newtons are allowed to have up to 6 legs of critters in them for each fig Newton because it's acceptable.
Only 6 legs?
60 people.
What if I need more protein?
No, I'm just saying it's
Yeah. Well, I know that they have to have minimum measurements because perfection is impossible. Okay, so now the new Mishnah. If a person brings a basket, now what they used to have was, let's say you're a salesman of bisamim, you sell spices, so that's called the rochel. Okay, so the rochel would come, he would have like a box, and inside, he would have saffron, he would have different items inside the box, and he would show you what he had, all the different things. Like a salesperson that comes to your house, they have like a box or a portfolio with all the different items inside. So if you did the afal bishesh b'minin harbe, even though essentially he's transporting multiple items, because he's carrying a bag of saffron, a bag of mint, a bag of all the different things that he carries, still, we don't say that because he's carrying multiple items, we look at it as multiple transgressions. It's all one thing because it's all in. In other words, if he had carried out first the mint, and then the saffron, and then the other one, we would say each one is a separate violation. If he did them in separate lapses of awareness. Now, if he did it all in one lapse of awareness, we would say that it's all conglomerated into one. But if he did it in separate lapses of awareness, we would say that each one is a distinct carrying. So here, that means like he forgot it was Shabbat.
Oh, it's Shabbat.
He took it out. He forgot it was Shabbat, then he realized it, and then he forgot again, and he took something else out. So if that were to happen, so the person would be culpable for 2. But here he's carrying out, effectively he's doing 10 acts of carrying in one. He consolidated because he put them all in one. So Tosafot has a problem here because he says, even if the person were to bring each one of these items out one after the other, in one lapse of awareness. He forgot it was Shabbat, he brought the mint, then he brought the saffron, then he brought the ginger, then he brought the whatever. So still, it would be considered all one thing because it was under one mistake. So he says, Kal v'chomer, if it's all in one box and he brought it out simultaneously, it's only one mistake. So Tosafot is struggling to figure out what is the chidush here. Obviously, it's only one mistake. So he says, maybe you would have thought, just like we learned earlier in the Masekhet, that if you had, let's say, a person ate pork, or they ate chelev, they ate forbidden fat, prepared as a boiled forbidden fat, and they had fried. Even though, and they didn't realize that it was forbidden fat, they thought it was kosher, and they ate one and they ate the other, that according to one view in the Gemara that we learned before, even though it was done under one mistake, it's 2 different things because it's 2 different dishes. So you might think the same thing here, that by carrying it out all in one box, even though you're carrying it in one box, since they're distinct items, we look at them as multiple transgressions happening simultaneously instead of one transgression. But it's a problem. Okay, so moving on. Zer onegina, seeds for the garden, pachot mikogrogeret, that you have to bring out less than a fig's worth, which means, according to the Rambam, a little bit less than a fig's worth. Normally for food, the measurement is a fig's worth. But here you're not going to be eating them, they're going to be planted, so less than a fig's worth is significant as well. The problem is that the Mishnah doesn't tell us exactly how much that means, which is very unusual. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera omer chamisha. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says 5 seeds of garden seeds. You get those little things at the store, right? Those little bags, and they have like a certain number of seeds in there. So 5 garden seeds is considered significant because that's how much you might go out to plant. Moving over to Amud Bet, Zera kishu'in shenayim. If you had cucumbers, 2 seeds. Zera dilu'in, gourds, also shenayim, 2. Zera pula mitzri, Egyptian bean, shenayim, also 2 seeds. Chagav chai, a live grasshopper, and this is talking about the type of grasshoppers that were kosher, the live locusts you can eat. Kol shehu, no matter how small it is, it's significant because it's alive. Met, if it's dead, kigrogeret. Now it has to be a fig size. Why? Because now it's a food. Because it's a kosher locust or grasshopper or whatever. So now it's food. Tziporet keramim. We're going to see what this is. A certain type of locust actually that lived among the trees. Ben chaya ben meta koshu. No matter whether it's alive or dead, even the smallest size, it's significant. We'll see why. Shematzni'in otal refuah, because they would use it for healing. We're going to see they had a whole complicated thing that they did with this particular locust. Rav Yehuda omer, afa motzi chagav chai tameh kol shehu shematzni'in oto lekatan lischok bo. So he says, the Tanakama said that only a kosher locust or grasshopper, when it's alive, it's significant even if it's tiny. And when it's dead, it's significant only if it's the size that would be considered a food, which is a fig size. Rabbi Yehuda says even a non-kosher one, if it's alive, even the tiniest size is significant. We're going to see why this is important in a second. So the Gemara says, we raise an objection. You're telling me that I need to have a certain number of seeds to be considered significant. I need 2 seeds, I need 5 seeds, I need almost a fig's worth of seeds. I need a lot of seeds for it to be considered significant. But we learned that if you take out fertilizer on Shabbat, even the amount to fertilize 1 stalk of cabbage or 1 leek plant is enough. So how many seeds does a leek plant come from? 1. How many seeds does 1 cabbage come from? 1. So why isn't 1 seed significant then? So the answer is similar to what we saw before. Amar Rav Papa, had dizaria, had lo zaria. Because again, it depends. When you go out planting, nobody says I'm going out to plant 1 seed. But once it's already planted and it's growing, each one is significant. In your garden, you're not going to say, I'm not going to water that cabbage, it's only 1 cabbage. It's already growing, you're going to water everyone. But to plant, you're not going to plant 1 cabbage, nobody does that. Correct? Even Jack threw more than 1 bean for the beanstalk. He didn't just throw 1. Now, Zera Kishrin, so again, that just shows you that it's all about context. When you're dealing with, just like with the dye before, when you're dealing with dye that's already made, so what you might use it for that would be considered a significant amount of dye is less than the amount of ingredients for dye. Because the amount of ingredients for dye, you would have to make a larger batch to justify making it. Similar here. Okay? To go out planting, you need a larger amount than what would be considered significant once it's already growing. Once it's already growing, every plant is significant. Zera kishuin. So cucumber seeds. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught hamotzi garinin. If you take out, and this is talking about pits of dates. If you're going to plant them because you want to grow more date trees, shtayim. 2 is significant. If you're carrying them out to eat, kimlo pi chazir, then the amount that fits in the mouth of a pig, which is 1. V'chama melo pi chazir achat. A pig can only, even someone who eats like a pig, and a pig can only eat 1. A date pit is pretty big. If you're using the pits in order to burn them, because you can burn date pits, they burn as fuel. So then the amount that it takes to cook in a light egg, which we learned means a chicken egg, right? A fig's worth of chicken egg mixed with, that's already scrambled and ready to go in the pan, right? That was the measurement. So the amount of fuel that's necessary to cook that, when it's all ready to go, optimally ready, that's the amount that's significant. If you're using the date pits as tokens to measure for counting, like you say, every $10 I'm going to put down 1 date pit. Right? You're using it for some kind of counting thing, an abacus or something. Okay, so then 2 is significant. Others say 5, because a person won't use a special implement for counting for less than 5. You can remember up to 4. If you bring 2 threads from the tail of a horsehair, horse threads, or from a cow tail, because they would use these to weave nets to catch other things. They would use, because horsehair is strong. The tail of a horse is strong hair, strong fabric, fibers are strong. Same with the with cow tail. Miksha shel chazir, the spine or from the back of a pig. So that achat, only one of them is significant. They would actually use that as needles. They would take like the sinew or how does Rashi describe it here? He says the hard threads in the back of the pig. I guess it's sinews or something. They would use that as a needle because it was very tough. Tzurei dekel shtayim. If you have palm fronds that would be used to weave baskets, you need at least 2 for it to be a significant amount. Torei dekel achat. But the vine, if you've ever seen certain palm trees, they have like the thing that goes around them. That even 1 is significant. Rashi says he doesn't know what they used it for. Some of the Mefarshim say they would use it as a whip because it was long and round. They would do that. So 1 is significant. Tziporet keramim ben chaya ben meitat kolshu. So what is tziporet keramim? You told me that tziporet keramim is something that whether it's alive or dead, even the smallest amount is significant because it's used as some kind of a healing. So now we're going to find out. My tziporet keramim. What is tziporet keramim? Amar Rav Palia be'areh. Rav says it's Palia be'areh, which is a certain type of locust. Amar Abaye Abaye said umishtakach b'dikla dechad nivara ve'avdela lechuchma. That this is found on the palm tree that has 1 vine going around it. There are different types of palm trees. So one of them has just 1 sort of vine-like thing that goes around the outside. It would live in this type of palm tree, and they would use it as a segula for wisdom. So how did they do it? The right half of the locust you would eat. It was a kosher locust. You would eat it. Then you would take the half. You would take the other half. The left half. Ramela begovta de nachasha. You would put it in a copper tube. V'chatim la b'shitin gush panke, and you would close it with 60 seals. Rashi says it doesn't really mean 60. It's just a figure of speech for a lot of seals. He says, a clay seal, and it could be a wax seal. Lots of different seals. You would put it in there. V'talela be'ivra dismala, and you would hang it on your left arm. So you ate the right half. You hung the other half in a copper thing on your left arm. V'chakim kama diba'eh. I'm sorry, I skipped part of it. V'simanech, and how do you remember that? Lev chacham limino. The heart of the wise is to the right. V'lev kesil ismolo, and the foolish person's heart is to the left. So if you're foolish and you need to fix it, you put it on your left arm. And then, v'chakim kema diba'eh, you would wisen up as much as you need. V'gamar kama diba'eh, and you would learn as much as you could. V'achil le'idach palga, and then you would eat the other half. Because if you don't then open the tube and eat the other half, you'll forget whatever you learned. So it would help you. It was like some kind of like memory booster or something. This is a special thing. So that's why even a small amount was significant, because they attached a very special role to this. Rabbi Yehuda omer afa motzi v'chulei. So Rabbi Yehuda said that there was a machloket whether a non-kosher grasshopper or locust, whatever we want to call it, whether they were also, whether a live one in the smallest amount, the smallest size, is also significant. So the Tanakh Kama savar lo. So the Tanakh Kama says no, that a small size non-kosher locust or non-kosher grasshopper would not be significant. So my tam, what's the reason? Dil ma'achile, because we said that what's the reason why a tiny kosher grasshopper is significant? Because a child will play with it. The Tanakh Kama says you're not going to give a non-kosher bug to your kid to play with because he might eat it. But if that's true, even a kosher one,
you should give it if it's alive.
Right, you might eat it alive. Because one time Rav Kahana was sitting in front of Rav, and they passed a grasshopper in front of his mouth, meaning it was near his mouth. He said, even though it's true that grasshoppers don't require shechita, they do require to be dead before you eat them. You can't eat them alive. He says it's bal tishakitzu, it's disgusting, it's undignified to eat a living creature. So I don't want anybody to think I'm eating it. So therefore, why can you even give a kosher living bug to your kid to play with it if they might eat it alive, and then they'd be violating the prohibition of bal tishakitzu? What it means is maybe he'll be playing with this grasshopper and it's going to die, and then he says, oh well, it's dead, I might as well eat it as a snack now, So Rabbi Yehuda imait katan mispad tzafile. So he says, Rabbi Yehuda says, you know what? If your pet dies, you don't eat it. You say a hesped over it, right? You're going to say hespedim. You're going to be very sad. So the Tanna Kama says, listen, you can only give a kosher bug or grasshopper or whatever it is to your child to play with, because if it dies, he might eat it, and therefore you shouldn't give him something non-kosher to eat. But that also means that that the significance, the grasshopper, even a tiny one, when it's alive, is going to be significant because you might give it to your child. A non-kosher one, since you won't give it to your child because it might die and he might eat it, therefore, it's not significant when it's tiny. It would only be significant if it was large enough, let's say, to feed an animal or whatever you might give it to. But it's not going to have significance at such a small measure. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's not true. Both kosher and non-kosher are both significant when they're alive and very small, because you would give a kosher or a non-kosher bug to your child to play with. Why? Because children form emotional attachments to their pets, and even if it dies, whether it's kosher or not kosher, the kid is not going to eat it. He's going to be very sad. And Hadran alach Amar Rabbi Akiva, Hadran alach Amar Rabbi Akiva, Hadran alach Amar Rabbi Akiva. We can conclude here the 9th parak of Masekhet Shabbat, and Be'ezrat Hashem, we will continue with Parak HaMatzniah tomorrow morning.